In April 2025, a cargo ship carrying millions of dollars worth of U.S. soybeans was halfway across the Pacific when it received an urgent rerouting order.
On April 2025, China stunned the world by canceling all U.S. soybean shipments, rerouting 2.4 million tons to Brazil. In just hours, $1.1 billion in contracts disappeared, leaving farmers reeling. Is this the end of U.S. dominance in global agriculture, or is there more to this bold move than meets the eye?
And the tariffs just make it worse.
We're already at a disadvantage, and then we throw the tariffs on top, then that's just not a good marketplace to be in. And part of this is too, we're not, world production leaders anymore in soybeans, so we've kind of taken second or third fiddle on the soybean production side.
What made this action even more significant was its timing. It came within 48 hours of President Trump's announcement of new tariffs on $90 billion worth of Chinese goods. Many saw it as a direct response to those tariffs, a calculated strike aimed at hitting Trump's base, American farmers. By pulling the rug out from under U.S. exporters, China wasn't just making a trade statement, it was sending a clear message to the world. They could disrupt global trade at will, and in an instant, $1.1 billion in soybean contracts evaporated, with no warning and no room for negotiation. The consequences for the U.S. soybean market were immediate and catastrophic. As soon as the news broke about the canceled shipments, the market reacted swiftly. Soybean prices at the Chicago Board of Trade plummeted by 8.2%, wiping out over $470 million in commodity value in a matter of days. This wasn't just a temporary dip, it was a dramatic crash that shook the very foundation of the U.S. agricultural economy. Farmers across the country were left to watch in disbelief as their livelihood was threatened by an international conflict they had no part in. The USDA's April 2025 report confirmed the severity of the situation. It revealed that unsold soybean inventories had surged by 13%, pushing storage levels to their highest point in years. This wasn't just a minor fluctuation, it was a full-blown crisis. For farmers, the message was clear: their crops were sitting unsold, with no buyers in sight. The cancellation of soybean orders was not just a financial setback, it was an existential threat. As farmers struggled to find new markets for their product, many feared that they might face bankruptcy. Statements from farmers like Matt Dunn, a fourth-generation farmer from Iowa, painted a bleak picture of the situation. In an interview with the Wall Street Journal, he expressed his frustration, saying, "We've been shut out mid-season with no contingency."
Right, and that's something that the president can consider. I don't want to prejudge the negotiations or the president's decision, but that's what we're doing.
Well, just some of the key exchanges. Let me tell you, that session is still continuing on.
This sudden move by China has had significant political and economic ramifications, particularly for President Trump and his supporters. As you know, Trump has built much of his political identity on the promise of being a champion for rural America, especially farmers who supported him in large numbers during his campaign. But now, with China's retaliation shaking the very foundation of the agricultural industry, these voters are now feeling the heat. In fact, this soybean disaster is hitting rural voters where it hurts the most, directly in their pockets. Farmers, many of whom are already struggling with low commodity prices and unpredictable weather, are now facing a devastating loss of income due to these canceled contracts. The U.S. soybean industry was one of the few remaining pillars of agricultural exports, and now that's in jeopardy. The political liability for Trump is huge. As China pulls away from U.S. soybeans, Brazil has quickly positioned itself as the go-to global supplier. This shift wasn't just a matter of chance. Brazil has been investing heavily in its agricultural infrastructures over the past few years, and it's paying off. Between 2020 and 2024, Brazil expanded its soybean acreage by 21%, supported by a massive $11.2 billion in infrastructure investments. The country's ports, freight corridors, and railways have been upgraded to facilitate faster and more efficient transportation of soybeans.
Trade talks. There's no change in US policy on these tariffs, so we will think about introducing retaliatory measures.
I think that is a key question that hasn't really been answered. The government is consulting with businesses in the UK about the impact of possible retaliatory.
What's fascinating is how this infrastructure overhaul has positioned Brazil as a direct competitor to the US. When China turned to Brazil to fill its soybean orders, it wasn't just about finding a quick replacement. It was about capitalizing on Brazil's newfound capacity. Brazil's reduced transport times and improved logistics made it easier for China to secure soybeans at a competitive price. This wasn't just a temporary move. It looks like China is making a permanent pivot to Brazil, reducing its reliance on the US altogether. Brazil's rise has been further cemented by its strengthened ties with China through the BRICS agreement. These agreements, which include Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, have provided Brazil with favorable trade terms, allowing it to bypass some of the restrictions and tariffs that the US faces. In particular, Brazil has fewer GMO restrictions and more relaxed environmental standards, which makes it a more attractive supply for China's growing demand for soybeans. As a result, Brazil isn't just a temporary replacement for the US in the soybean market, it's now a permanent competitor. With its strategic investment and strong trade relationships, Brazil is setting itself up to challenge the US in agricultural exports for the long haul.
The American Soybean Association's president says it's not good news for America's soybean farmers.
China takes more of our soybeans than all other foreign customers combined. So they're a major part of our market.
China's sudden move to halt US soybean shipment isn't just a short-term blow to American farmers, it's a signal that the global food trade might be entering a new phase. The world of international trade has long been shaped by the dominance of major players like the US and China, but with China's strategic pivot away from American soybeans and towards Brazil, things are starting to shift in ways that could have lasting effects. This isn't just about soybeans either. If China can reconfigure its supply chains and shift its agricultural dependencies so quickly, it suggests that other nations might start reconsidering their own trade routes and partners as well. The broader implications for the global food trade are profound. For years, the US has been one of the world's largest suppliers of agricultural commodities, but as China reorients its soybean supply to Brazil, other countries might start to follow suit, especially if they see Brazil as a more reliable, cheaper, or politically stable option. If more countries decide to rely on Brazil and other emerging markets instead of the US, we could see a major reshaping of the agricultural supply chain we've grown accustomed to.
Did it pivot just as swiftly if necessary? These weren't just academic questions. They were questions about how global power would be shaped in the years ahead. Meanwhile, Bloomberg was among the first to report on the names behind the canceled orders.
China's decision to stop buying US soybeans is more than just a fleeting disruption in the trade war. It could signal the beginning of the end for the US's dominance in agricultural exports. For years, the US has enjoyed the status of being one of the largest exporters of agricultural goods, with soybeans playing a critical role in that equation. But now, with China turning to Brazil for its soybean needs, it's clear that the US may not be as indispensable as it once was.
2 days after President Trump unveiled a new round of tariffs targeting $90 billion worth of Chinese-made goods. China's move, by contrast, didn't rely on announcing sweeping new tariffs of its own. Instead, it removed a key buyer from the US economy.
The problem for the US is that it relied too heavily on one major customer, China. For decades, China was a huge consumer of American soybeans. But as global trade has become more complex, China is diversifying its sources. Brazil's ability to step in and fill the gap show that the US is no longer the only game in town. Brazil has made massive investments in infrastructure and agricultural development, giving it the capacity to supply China with more soybeans, often at lower costs and fewer restrictions than the US can offer. China's strategic shift away from US soybeans is part of a larger trend that could lead to permanent structural shifts in global trade routes. When China suddenly decided to cancel its soybean contracts with US exporters, it wasn't just a slap in the face to American farmers. It was a calculated move that reshaped how goods will flow across the globe for the foreseeable future. So, what are your thoughts on this? Let us know in the comments below.